Welcome to Chapter 12 video presentation. Chapter 12 is devoted to the topic of administering procurements. It contains ideas, techniques, and issues related to the process of managing a relationship with a seller after a contract between a buyer and a seller is signed. This video presentation, just like all video presentations in this course, are based on a book titled Project Procurement Management, Contracting, Subcontracting, and Teaming by Quinton Fleming. These are the learning outcomes for this chapter. After completing Chapter 12, you should be able to list and briefly discuss the two broad goals of procurement administration. You should also be able to explain how true cost performance should be managed and measured. You should also be able to evaluate usefulness of earned value management in relation to procurement administration, explain the purpose and organization of project status review meetings, explain the privity of contract principle and how it influences contractual relationships among buyers and second-order sellers. You should also be able to list the items commonly displayed in project rooms, explain how changes to project procurement should be managed, and explain the concept of constructive changes. So let's start with some preliminary thoughts. Procurement management does not begin with an award of a contract. Procurement management begins when a new project is initiated, and this is when procurement planning starts. It precedes procurement administration and influences procurement administration. So in other words, the way you administer your procurement should be outlined during the planning phase. Now, procurement administration has two broad goals, and those are the two main goals as well. Number one, continuous monitoring of seller performance. In other words, making sure that the seller is delivering on the contract based on all the terms and conditions specified in the contract. And then goal number two is managing changes to the seller's agreed upon baseline. For most projects, changes, at least minor ones, to the agreed upon baseline that is once again clearly outlined in the contract are inevitable, and the question becomes how to deal with those changes, how to process them in a way that does not compromise the overall integrity of the project and at the same time is fair to the seller, because it is buyer's responsibility to specify what needs to be delivered. So those are some of the preliminary thoughts in relation to procurement administration. Now, one of the most crucial tasks when it comes to administering procurements is measuring cost performance. A lot of managers assess cost performance by comparing planned cost versus actual cost. In other words, how much we were planning to spend and how much we're actually spending. Now, this is not true cost performance. The thing is, money spent should be evaluated in the light of work performed. Without that second component, without that second variable, the amount of money spent is really useless as a metric. Because just because you spend a lot of money does not mean that you're somehow lagging behind in relation to cost goals, because if you're also accomplishing a lot of work with that money spent, then the seller is in line with what was agreed upon. However, if a lot of money is being spent without accomplishing the goals that were outlined in the contract, then it's a problem. So cost performance, giving those ideas, cost performance is the difference between work performed measured in dollars and the money spent to perform that work. So if there's a big difference between these two, then this is a problem. Now, one formal approach to evaluating cost performance of a project is the so-called earned value management, or EVM approach. Specifically, something that is relevant for procurement administration is the Cost Performance Index, or CPI, which is a very important indicator under the Earned Value Management methodology. So what is CPI? CPI shows the relationship between earned value, calculated by multiplying the percent of actual work performed by the budgeted cost, and the actual cost spent to perform this amount of work. So this is the formula for CPI, earned value divided by actual cost. So why is CPI important, and why is it a useful benchmark or indicator for administering procurements? Well, CPI was found to be a reliable, within 10% of actual performance, predictor of actual project performance, even if the project is only 15 or 20% completed. So this is how it will look like. So let's say you have the following schedule for your project, and the entire schedule involves certain tasks that are also plotted against the timeline, so you can see when those tasks are to be completed. Now let's say we're somewhere here, so this is beginning of April, and the following two tasks, developing a detailed schedule and excavation, they were planned to be completed, let's say by early April, as you can see from the timeline here. Now let's say that the budgeted cost for performing these two tasks were $10 and $100 respectively, and then you also have task completion progress. So in for both of those tasks, task has been completed in their entirety. So we have 100% completion by early April for both tasks. And then let's say you ended up spending $10 as budgeted for the first task and $100 for the excavation task as budgeted. So in this case, the CPI is 100%, because if you multiply the value of the task by the completion percentage, which is 100% of 1, you get $10, right? And here, if you divide $10 by the total payments of $10, you get 100%. Also, you can perform those calculations by summing up these amounts and dividing it by the sum of total payments. Okay. Now, if the completion rate, if the task completion percentage was less than 100%, let's say it's 80%, right? So in that case, the value earned, just as the formula suggests here, the earned value would be $8, and here, if the task completion percentage is 80%, it would be $88. Sorry, $80. So in total, it would be the earned value for these two tasks would be $88. And if you divide 88 by 110, you get a value that is less than 100%, right? So in that case, you have an indicator that you will be going over the budget with your project, because the CPI, the cost performance index, falls below 100%. So this is how the CPI indicator, which is a part of a broader methodology of earned value management, can be used for tracking cost performance during the procurement administration phase. Now, things become a bit harder when you're trying to use this technique for managing fixed price contracts, because for many fixed price contracts, the seller is not obliged to provide any cost actuals. In other words, they promise you to deliver something within the specified cost, but they're not going to report to you the cost or the progress of individual items. However, sellers can still be required to provide schedule of values, in other words, what kind of work they promise to complete by what date, and how much money they will end up spending on performing that work. So oftentimes payments are based on those schedules of values. In other words, as sellers complete certain components of the overall contract, then in proportion to that, the seller is compensated by the buyer. So sometimes, fixed price contracts also have that allowance for monitoring cost performance. Project status reviews are also something that is very important, and something that can be used for administering procurements. Most big projects hold periodic status review meetings, where those meetings are chaired by the project manager, and the main purpose of those meetings is to compare performance against schedules and budgets, so that all the important stakeholders can see where they're at. Now, one important rule for communicating project status to important stakeholders is that bad news should not be withheld from such meetings. A project manager may or may not get in trouble for going over the budget or delaying the project, but he or she will definitely get into trouble when trying to hide the fact that the project is likely to go over the budget or over the originally agreed upon schedule. So lying is typically not tolerated, while certain mistakes, project management mistakes, can be forgiven. Now, sellers must take part or should take part in these meetings to see where the project stands in relation to procurements and what kind of role they play in ensuring that the project is delivered on time and within budget. Now, another important issue that often arises during procurement administration is the concept or the issue of privity of contract. Now, privity of contract can be defined as the connection or relationship which exists between two or more contracting persons or organizations. So this is how the problem is described, and this is how the problem arises. You see, company X, the buyer, may have a contract with company Y to deliver something. So in that case, company X is the buyer while company Y is the seller. Now, company Y may also have a contract with company Z to assist company Y on the project that company X commissioned company Y for. In that case, company X has a privity of contract. In other words, they have a contractual relationship with company Y, but it is company Y that has a contractual relationship with company Z. Company X has no contractual relationship or no privity of contract with company Z. So, given that arrangement, company X is not in a position to dictate, to manage, to administer things on the company Z side. So if they do something like that, if they go to company Z, then company Z may complain, or they may submit like a formal complaint to either company Y, or sometimes this can even end up in court saying that company X is somehow intervening with the work of company Z, and that intervention is not legal, meaning it's not outlined in the contract that company Z has with company Y. So although company X may feel that they have certain right to intervene with the work of company Z, legally speaking, they don't have that right. If they wish to influence company Z in any way, they should deal with company Z through company Y by submitting requests to company Y first. So this is the issue of the privity of contract as explained in this diagram. Now, also many projects have some form of status displays. Sometimes it's a dedicated room or a wall on a room, or nowadays it's becoming more common to display status of a project using a website or some kind of web repository. Now, here is the list of the kind of artifacts that may be included in a project status display. So I'm not going to list all of them one by one, but you can just pause this video for a minute and then look at the list of items. Now, another important issue in administering procurement is managing changes to project procurements. For most projects, changes to project scope are inevitable. Nobody's smart enough to create a blueprint for the entire project, especially if it's a complex project, especially if it spans multiple years, because life is more complicated than that. It will inevitably introduce certain changes to the scope. If one cannot accommodate those changes, the project will never get done. It's sticking to the originally agreed upon scope may be a way of sabotaging the project, because some flexibility is always needed to get things done and to bring any project to a completion. So changes are unavoidable, and therefore, it's not a bad thing to accommodate certain changes. However, those introduced changes, they need to be managed. They cannot be done in a chaotic ad hoc fashion. There needs to be a process for that. Ultimately, project manager should approve all changes, because it is the project manager who has a broad project level perspective on things, as opposed to having a piecemeal, partial understanding of certain areas of the project. When thinking about those changes, whether to allow them or not, technical considerations should be balanced with the time and cost constraints. So it's those are the three perspectives from which the question of whether whether to go with a particular change or not should be looked at. Now, another thing to keep in mind, of course, is that as the project progresses, it becomes harder and more expensive to implement changes. It is relatively easy to do changes to project requirements during the initial concept phase, but as you go into definitions and execution, where most of the time and money is spent, it's becoming more costly to go back and introduce any changes. And of course, after the delivery, when an information system or any kind of product or service that is a result of the project go live, this is when it's extremely expensive to go back and make any changes. So as a project manager, you should encourage people to think about things and brainstorm and do changes in the early phases. But then you need to make it much harder to make changes during subsequent phases, because it's simply very expensive, right? It's very expensive and time consuming to do those changes during later phases. So all requests for changes during the later phases of the project, they have to be scrutinized with more effort than the changes that are proposed during the initial phases of a project. So in order to process those changes, one needs to have a formal integrated change control system. So what is a change control system? It's a formal documented process that describes when and how official project documents may be changed. It also describes the people authorized to make changes, the paperwork required for those changes, and any automated or manual tracking systems that the project will use, so that those changes can be properly captured and followed through. A change control system often includes a change control board, which is a committee, as well as configuration management and the process for communicating changes. So configuration management can be viewed as a set of documents that outline the technical and non-technical requirements towards the final product or service that the project is supposed to deliver. And also a process for communicating changes, because just because you make changes in your project documentation does not mean that everybody is aware of those changes, and people may ignore it and proceed as if no change has been approved. So a formal system is necessary for processing those changes, comprised of the components listed here. Now there's another legal concept of constructive change, and this is something that is intimately related to change management. It is the responsibility of the buyer to define the procured work to the seller. If the definition is not adequate or changes are needed from the buyer's side, then the buyer interferes with the seller's performance. So constructive changes doctrine or concept is all about that. Under what conditions a buyer has the right to intervene in seller's performance, and what is the fair compensation for the seller if that intervention happens. So a constructive change to a procurement can be oral, written, meaning a buyer may formally inform the seller that certain changes need to be done, either verbally or in a written form, or sometimes it's an act of omission, meaning nothing is communicated from the buyer to the seller, but it is the lack of communication that causes seller to spend additional time or additional resources to deliver the scope that was initially agreed with the buyer. So constructive changes doctrine is common in government and in construction contracting, and the doctrine comes down to this: the seller, that's the most important aspect of this doctrine. The seller might be entitled to extra compensation for constructive changes if that's the fault of the buyer. So here we have examples of some actions that can result constructive changes on the seller side: accelerating or delaying the period of the seller performance, giving a seller a specification which contains defect, meaning inaccurate specification, changing specification, statement of work, terms and conditions, etc., interfering with the performance of the supplier, rejecting a seller's deliverables even though they meet the procurement specifications, adding additional or excessive testing, stopping and starting the work of the seller, because just because the work stops on the buyer side, and that may not be an issue, stopping the work on the seller side may create certain costs and issues, for example, related to idle capacities, let's say labor or factory capacities, also storage cost, because they need to store the things that have been already manufactured. So all those things, they create problems on the seller side. And if one of those things happen, then the seller may be entitled to compensation. Now the final comment is about administering time or time and materials contract. These type of contracts were meant to be for routine buys, but some buyers will use time or time and materials contract to procure major complexity items. The issue here is boundaries, because a major complexity procurement can potentially take an infinite time or an infinite quantity of materials to be completed. So the nature and boundaries of these arrangements need to be carefully explored and specified in order to avoid potential problems when time and materials become like a bottomless pit when something complex is delivered by a seller. So that completes chapter 12. Thank you for listening.